During an elegant corporate event, a millionaire arrives at the luxury hotel where his executive girlfriend is already waiting for him. They sit together, and soon after, the woman gets up to go to the restroom. Moments later, the millionaire is startled when a little beggar girl runs up to his table. Panting, she whispers, "Sir, she put something in your wine." Before his girlfriend returns, he decides to swap the wine glasses. 2 hours later, the millionaire is left utterly shocked by what happens next. The sound of the string quartet echoed softly through the ballroom of the grand, majestic hotel, mingling with the elegant murmur of conversation and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses. Edward Shaw adjusted his Italian silk tie and glanced at his reflection in the lobby's grand mirror. At 52, he carried the upright posture of a man who had built a corporate empire from nothing. But his brown eyes held a vulnerability few could see behind the facade of success. "You look perfect," whispered Isabella Vance, sliding her hand along his arm as she approached. Her navy blue gown hugged her curves with calculated elegance, and a pearl necklace reflected the light from the bohemian crystal chandelier. As executive vice president of Shaw Corp, she had not only secured a prominent position in the company, but also won Edward's heart over the past 8 months. Edward smiled, feeling the comforting familiarity that always accompanied her presence. Isabella possessed a sharp intellect that had impressed him from her first day, when she arrived with an impeccable resume and a drive that reminded him of himself decades ago. The quarterly results presentation was an absolute success, she commented, surveying the entrepreneurs mingling in the main hall. The investors are thrilled with the international expansion numbers. Shaw Corp's annual charity gala always drew the city's business elite. Edward had started the tradition 5 years prior, donating the proceeds to institutions that cared for at-risk children. It was a cause close to his heart, born from his own experiences with childhood poverty before determination, and a few fortunate encounters completely changed the course of his life. "I need to greet the mayor before dinner," Edward said, straightening his shirt cuffs. "The new factory project depends on his approval." "I'm going to the powder room to touch up my makeup," Isabella replied, lightly touching her face. "Meet you at the main table in 10 minutes?" Edward nodded and walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city's main square. The city lights created a golden mosaic against the night sky, and he allowed himself a moment to contemplate how much his life had changed. From a boy who slept in makeshift shelters, he had become one of the most respected businessmen in the country. That's when he saw her. Outside the hotel, near the illuminated garden, a small, familiar figure paced nervously among the ornamental trees. Annie, just 6 years old, wore shabby but clean clothes, her brown hair tied in 2 uneven braids. Edward recognized her immediately. She was the same girl he encountered almost daily near his office, always polite, never directly asking for handouts, but gratefully accepting the change he discreetly offered. Something about the child's posture bothered him. She seemed agitated, constantly looking toward the hotel windows as if searching for someone specific. Edward frowned, wondering what a child would be doing there so late. His thoughts were interrupted when Annie spotted him through the glass. Her eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and urgency that made Edward's heart inexplicably race. The girl gave a small wave, pointing to a side entrance of the hotel. Intrigued and concerned, Edward decided to investigate. He walked through the luxurious corridors to the service door that opened onto the side garden. When he opened it, Annie ran toward him, breathless and visibly nervous. "Uncle Ed," she called in a low voice, using the affectionate name she had adopted weeks ago. "I need to talk to you. It's really important." "Annie, what are you doing here?" he asked, kneeling to her level. "It's very late, and this isn't a safe place for you to be alone." The girl glanced around quickly, as if afraid of being seen, then moved closer, Her next words came out in a desperate whisper that made Edward's blood run cold. "Uncle, she put something in your wine. I saw her when you weren't looking." Edward felt the world spin as he processed the girl's words. His hands trembled slightly, and he had to lean against the stone garden wall to keep his balance. Annie's claim echoed in his mind like a disturbing premonition, directly confronting everything he believed about Isabella. "Annie, are you sure about what you're saying?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the storm of emotions. "This is very serious, little one." The girl nodded vigorously, her dark eyes shining with a determination that belied her age. "I was hiding behind those big plants near the window. The pretty lady who's always with you took a tiny little bag from her purse and dumped a white powder into your glass. She stirred it with her pinky and looked around to see if anyone was watching." A wave of nausea washed over Edward. For 8 months, Isabella had been his confidant, his partner in business and in life. She knew all, his corporate secrets, his emotional vulnerabilities, his hopes for the future. The possibility of betrayal from her was like a dagger to the heart. "Why were you watching, Annie?" he asked, still trying to find a logical explanation for this surreal situation. "I always hang around when there are parties. At the big hotels," the girl explained, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her worn sweater. "Sometimes people leave good food in the trash, or someone gives me something. When I saw you at the window, I wanted to say hi, but then I saw the lady do that, and I got scared." Edward looked through the hotel windows, watching the elegant movement of guests in the ballroom. Isabella hadn't returned from the powder room yet, and his wine glass sat untouched on their reserved table. A rational part of his mind argued that a 6-year-old could have been mistaken, imagined things, or even made up a story for attention. But another, deeper part of his consciousness, the one that had helped him survive on the streets and build a corporate empire, whispered that something was profoundly wrong. Annie had never lied to him in all their months of casual encounters. On the contrary, she had always shown a brutal honesty that touched him deeply. "Annie, I need you to hide and stay safe," he said, pulling a few bills from his wallet. "Go to Miss Carmen's shelter tonight. We'll talk more about this tomorrow." The girl took the money, but hesitated before leaving. "Uncle Ed, you're not going to drink that wine, are you? I have a bad feeling about it." "Don't you worry about me," he replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "You were very brave to warn me. Now go and be careful." Edward watched Annie disappear into the garden's shadows before returning to the hotel. Each step toward the ballroom felt heavier than the last. His mind raced, analyzing every recent interaction with Isabella, searching for signs he might have missed. She had been responsible for organizing the details of tonight's event. She knew the schedule perfectly, knew exactly where he would be at every moment. If there was indeed a substance in his wine, she would have had ample opportunity to add it undetected. When Edward returned to the ballroom, he found Isabella already back at the table, discreetly touching up her lipstick while observing the other guests. She smiled radiantly as he approached, and for a moment he almost convinced himself that Annie had been mistaken. "You took a while," Isabella commented, adjusting her hair. "Did you find the mayor?" "Yes, we had a productive conversation," Edward lied, sitting beside her, his eyes fixed on the glass of red wine awaiting him, the dark liquid reflecting the chandelier's lights like a sinister mirror. Isabella followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "Is something wrong with the wine? You seem worried." The innocent question made Edward's heart pound. Was it genuine concern or a subtle attempt to encourage him to drink? He studied her face, searching for any sign of nervousness or guilt, but found only her usual affectionate expression. "Just tired," he replied, picking up the glass. It's been a long day. Edward raised the wine toward his lips, carefully watching Isabella's reaction. She smiled encouragingly, but something in her eyes, an almost imperceptible anxiety, confirmed his worst fears. In a swift, discreet move, he feigned a slight stumble, causing a few drops of wine to splash onto the white tablecloth. He used the distraction to switch his glass with Isabella's, which was positioned on the other side of the table. "How clumsy of me," he muttered, dabbing the drops with his napkin. Isabella didn't notice the switch, busy greeting other business leaders who were approaching their table. Edward watched her automatically pick up the glass that now held the wine originally intended for him, and an icy chill ran down his spine. If Annie was right, in a few hours he would know the truth about the woman he loved. The next 2 hours passed in a torturous eternity for Edward. He forced business conversations with investors, smiled for official photographs, and delivered the opening speech for the charity event. But his attention remained fixed on Isabella. Every gesture, every facial expression, every word she spoke was minutely analyzed for clues to her true intentions. Initially, Isabella seemed completely normal. She chatted animatedly with the executives' spouses, discussed market strategies with the attending VPs, and exuded the natural charm that always made her stand out at social events. Edward began to wonder if he was being paranoid, if Annie's warning was just a product of a child's imagination. However, as time went on, subtle changes began to appear in Isabella's behavior. First, she discreetly touched her forehead a few times, as if feeling a slight headache. Then Edward noticed she was blinking more frequently than usual, and her responses in conversations started to become slightly slower. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked during a pause between official greetings, feigning casual concern. "Just a little tired," Isabella replied, forcing a smile. "It must be the stress of the event. We worked so hard to make sure tonight was perfect." Edward nodded understandingly, but internally his heart was racing. If there was indeed a substance in the wine, Isabella's symptoms were exactly what he would expect to see. The gradual confirmation of his worst fears made him nauseous, but also determined to uncover the whole truth. During the official dinner, Isabella barely touched her food. Her movements became progressively slower, and she began to lean more frequently on the table. Edward watched discreetly, torn between genuine concern for her health and the growing horror of confirming that she had indeed tried to drug him. "Isabella, you look very pale," commented the mayor's wife seated next to her. "Are you sure you're all right?" "Perhaps it's just the heat in the ballroom," Isabella murmured, passing a hand over her forehead. Her words were slightly slurred, and Edward realized she was struggling to maintain her composure. The situation became critical when the master of ceremonies announced the start of the charity auctions. Isabella tried to stand to accompany Edward to the stage, but her legs buckled dangerously. She gripped the table, breathing heavily. "I think I need some fresh air," she whispered, visible panic starting to take over her expression. Edward discreetly supported her, his heart torn between the instinct to protect her and the terrifying realization that he was witnessing the consequences of a plan that had been directed at him. If it weren't for the courage of a 6-year-old girl, he would be the one falling ill right now. "Let's go to the terrace," he suggested, guiding her carefully between the tables. They didn't even make it halfway. Isabella staggered violently. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into Edward's arms in front of all the guests. The elegant ballroom instantly transformed into a scene of panic and confusion. "Call an ambulance!" Edward shouted, kneeling on the marble floor as he tried to check Isabella's vital signs. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak, and she had completely lost consciousness. Guests crowded around them, whispering theories and speculations. Edward heard fragments of conversations that made him shudder. Was it something she ate? Maybe it was poisoning. Who had access to her food? Dr. Henry Carter, one of the investors present, who was also a physician, knelt beside Edward to examine Isabella. His experienced hands checked her pupils, pulse, and other vitals while they awaited the paramedics. "Her pupils are dilated, and her breathing is depressed," he murmured in a low voice to Edward. "This looks like intoxication by some kind of central nervous system depressant." Edward felt the floor drop out from under him. The preliminary medical confirmation fully validated Annie's warning. Isabella had indeed put something in his wine, something powerful enough to cause such a severe reaction. When the paramedics arrived and began emergency procedures, Edward noticed the curious and suspicious glances some guests were directing at him. As the event organizer and Isabella's partner, he would naturally be one of the first people questioned about what had happened. Mr. Shaw, a detective who had arrived with the ambulance, approached him. "We need to ask you a few questions about what Miss Vance consumed tonight." Edward looked at Isabella being carried away on a stretcher, unconscious and vulnerable, and felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of him still loved the woman he thought he knew, but another part was terrified by the discovery of who she really was. As he followed the ambulance to the hospital, one question haunted his thoughts. If Isabella had planned to drug him during the event, what was the next step in her plan? And more importantly, who else might be involved in the conspiracy? St. Jude's Hospital was shrouded in the silence of early morning when Edward was finally able to sit in the ICU waiting room. His elegant suit contrasted sharply with the clinical environment, and he felt completely out of place in a setting that smelled of disinfectant and despair. He had been subjected to 3 intense hours of police questioning, repeatedly answering the same questions about every detail of the evening. Dr. Carter emerged from the elevator with a grave expression, followed closely by Detective Marcus Riley, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes who showed no sympathy for Edward. Isabella's lab work was complete, and the results would officially confirm the poisoning suspicions. The tests revealed the presence of zolpidem in high concentration, Dr. Carter announced, consulting the chart. "It's a potent sedative, typically used for insomnia, but in high doses it can cause exactly the symptoms we witnessed." A chill ran down Edward's spine. Zolpidem was easily obtainable with a prescription, but could also be acquired illegally. The substance was virtually undetectable when dissolved in red wine, making the method of poisoning almost perfect. "Mr. Shaw," Detective Riley interjected, "I need you to explain again how the glasses were served tonight. Who had access to Ms. Vance's drinks?" "I've already explained this several times," Edward answered, fighting to maintain his patience. "The wine was served by the hotel's head waiter before dinner. Dozens of people were circulating by our table throughout the event." The detective took meticulous notes, but Edward could sense skepticism in every word. The situation was devastatingly ironic. He was being investigated for a crime that was originally planned against him. If he told them about Annie's warning and the glass switch, he would be forced to explain how a homeless child had witnessed the poisoning, which could sound like a fanciful story. "We have information that you and Ms. Vance have been having some professional disagreements recently," the detective continued, consulting his notes. "Several Shaw Corp employees mentioned tensions related to the company's international expansion." Edward frowned, genuinely confused. "What kind of tensions?" "Isabella has always supported every expansion project. She herself coordinated the negotiations with the European investors. According to our sources, she had been questioning some of your financial decisions in recent weeks," Riley revealed. "Apparently, there were concerns about accounting irregularities." The accusation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He had never heard Isabella express any concern about the company's financial management. On the contrary, she always praised his transparency and business ethics. If there were really sources making such claims, it meant the conspiracy was far more elaborate than he had initially imagined. "That is completely false," Edward declared, his voice thick with indignation. "My company has undergone 3 independent audits this year. All reports are available for public review." "We understand your position, Mr. Shaw," the detective replied diplomatically. "However, we need to investigate all possibilities. Do you have any idea who might have an interest in harming Miss Vance?" The question was an obvious trap, and Edward recognized it immediately. If he suggested Isabella had enemies, he would be implicitly admitting he didn't know her well enough to protect her. If he claimed she was universally liked, he would be reinforcing the theory that he was the only suspect with a motive to harm her. "Isabella is respected by everyone at the company," he answered carefully. "I can't imagine who would wish her harm." Dr. Carter interrupted the growing tension with a medical update. "Miss Vance is stable, but still unconscious. With the amount of sedative found in her system, she could remain this way for another 12 to 24 hours. Edward requested permission to see her, and after a prolonged hesitation, the detective agreed, accompanying him to the ICU room. Isabella was connected to several monitors, her pale face contrasting with her dark hair splayed on the hospital pillow. Seeing her in that vulnerable state stirred a confusion of feelings in Edward. Part of him still refused to fully believe that the woman he loved had tried to drug him. Perhaps there was an alternative explanation. Perhaps she herself was a victim of a more complex plot. But the evidence was irrefutable. Annie had seen Isabella put something in his wine, and now Isabella was hospitalized as a result of drinking that substance. "Mr. Shaw," the detective said in a low voice, "I recommend you hire a lawyer. The investigation is just beginning, and your position as the primary person of interest could become complicated quickly." Edward nodded mechanically, but his mind was focused on much more disturbing questions. If Isabella had indeed planned to drug him, what was the ultimate goal? To steal corporate secrets, to force him to sign compromising documents? Or was there something even more sinister behind her actions? When he finally left the hospital in the early hours of the morning, Edward realized his life had changed irrevocably. In less than 12 hours, he had gone from a respected businessman to the prime suspect in a poisoning case. His reputation, built over decades, was being publicly questioned. But above all, one question haunted him. Where was Annie? And was she safe after having witnessed something that could be extremely dangerous for the wrong people to know? Edward couldn't sleep for a single hour after returning home. His mansion in the city's most affluent neighborhood, which had always represented achievement and security, now felt like a gilded cage where every shadow hid invisible threats. He spent the early morning hours pacing the luxurious rooms, his mind working furiously to connect the pieces of a puzzle that grew more complex with each new discovery. At 7 a.m., Edward left the house with a clear mission: find Annie before anyone with malicious intent discovered the crucial role she had played the night before. The girl was his only witness, the only person who could confirm his version of events and potentially save him from the unjust accusation of poisoning. His first destination was downtown, near the Shaw Corp building, where he used to see Annie on his daily commute. The bustling morning streets contrasted sharply with the elegance of the previous night's event, reminding him of the harsh reality many children faced daily. "Mr. Shaw," called Miss Carmen, a 60-year-old woman who ran a small makeshift shelter. in an abandoned building. What a surprise to see you here so early. I'm looking for Annie, Edward explained, trying to mask the urgency in his voice. Have you seen her this morning? Miss Carmen frowned, genuine concern appearing in her tired eyes. No, and that's strange. The girl always shows up for breakfast at 7:30. She came in agitated last night, said she had enough money to stay for a few days, but she left very early, before dawn. A knot tightened in Edward's chest. Annie had used the money he gave her to secure a safe place at the shelter, but something had made her leave before her usual time. This could mean she was scared, or worse, that someone had already discovered her involvement in the previous night's events. Did she say anything about being scared or worried? Edward asked. Now that you mention it, yes, Miss Carmen replied, nervously fidgeting with her apron. She said she saw something very bad at the rich people's party and that dangerous people might be looking for her. I thought it was just a child's imagination. Edward thanked her quickly and went in search of others who might have information about Annie's whereabouts. He spoke with street vendors, homeless people and city cleaning crews, but no one had seen the girl since very early that morning. It was then that he found Sebastian, a middle-aged man who had lived on the streets for over a decade and knew every corner of the downtown area. His eyes showed a sharp intelligence honed by years of urban survival, and he immediately recognized Edward's genuine concern. "Little Annie?" "Man, you're too late," Sebastian said, shaking his head gravely. "Some men in suits have been here looking for her since 5 this morning. They weren't cops. I know what cops looked like. These guys were something else." Edward felt his blood run cold. "What kind of men? Did you hear what they wanted?" "2 well-dressed guys driving a black foreign car," Sebastian described, gesturing nervously. "They were asking about a little girl who's been talking too much about things she shouldn't. They were offering money for information on where she usually sleeps." The confirmation of Edward's worst fears left him desperate. Annie was officially in danger, which meant the conspiracy was far more serious than he had imagined. Someone had quickly discovered that the girl was a witness to the poisoning and now wanted to silence her. "Sebastian, this is very important," Edward said, pulling several bills from his wallet. "I need to find Annie before these men do. Do you have any idea where she might be hiding?" Sebastian studied Edward's face for a long moment, seemingly assessing his intentions. "You seem like a good guy. You've always been nice to the kid. There are some spots she knows, hideouts that only the street kids know about. But man, if these guys are who I think they are, you're messing with very dangerous people." Edward spent the next few hours scouring abandoned sites, unfinished construction projects, and dark alleys where Annie might be hiding. Each empty location heightened his anguish, and he began to fear he was already too late to protect the girl who had saved his life. It was late in the afternoon when he received an unexpected call on his cell phone. Dr. Carter informed him that Isabella had regained consciousness and was urgently asking to speak with him. According to the doctor, she seemed extremely agitated and kept repeating that she had important information about what had happened. Edward was torn between continuing his search for Annie and going to the hospital to confront Isabella. Part of him still hoped she could provide explanations that would clear up the whole mess, but another part feared it was just another trap. He decided to go to the hospital, but first he made a call to Peter Nash, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city. If Isabella was really awake and talking, he needed to be prepared for any revelation that might come from that meeting. As he drove through the city streets toward the hospital, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Annie. A 6-year-old girl was in mortal danger for trying to protect him, and he felt completely powerless to help her. What terrified him most was the possibility that when he finally arrived at the hospital, he would discover that Isabella had orchestrated everything from the beginning, including her own hospitalization, as part of a plan even more diabolical than he could imagine. The ICU hallway echoed with the rhythmic beeping of medical monitors when Edward finally arrived at St. Jude's Hospital. Peter Nash, his lawyer, was already waiting for him in the reception area with a grave expression that indicated further complications. The 55-year-old man, known for his prowess in complex criminal cases, carried a briefcase full of documents that did not bode well. "Edward, we need to talk before you speak with Isabella," Peter said, guiding him to a private room. "The situation has escalated significantly in the last few hours." Edward sat heavily in the plastic chair, feeling the weight of a rapidly deteriorating reality. "What now?" "The media got a hold of the poisoning story," Peter revealed, opening an evening paper. "The headline suggests you tried to eliminate Isabella to take full control of the company. Someone leaked detailed information about alleged financial irregularities you were supposedly trying to hide." Edward read the sensational headlines with growing horror. "Millionaire tries to poison girlfriend at charity gala. Financial scandal. At Shaw Corp, CEO accused of attempted murder. The fall of an empire, Edward Shaw under criminal investigation." "This is impossible," Edward muttered, his voice filled with despair. "This information is completely fabricated. Who had access to such specific details about the investigation?" "That's the most worrying question," Peter replied gravely. "Only a few people knew those details, including the police, the hospital, and you. Someone with privileged access is orchestrating a deliberate campaign to destroy your reputation." Before Edward could fully process the implications, Dr. Carter appeared at the door. "Mr. Shaw, Ms. Vance is asking to see you urgently. She seems very agitated and insists she has crucial information about what happened last night." Edward followed the doctor through the sterile hospital corridors, closely flanked by Peter and Detective Riley, who had unexpectedly shown up to supervise. The meeting, every step toward Isabella's room, heightened the tension in Edward's chest. When the room's doors opened, Edward found Isabella sitting up in bed, connected to an IV drip, but seemingly alert. Her eyes, normally bright and confident, now held a vulnerability he had never seen before. For a moment, Edward almost forgot all his suspicions and was simply relieved to see her conscious. "Edward," she called in a weak voice, reaching a hand toward him. "Thank God you're okay. I was so worried." "How are you feeling?" he asked, maintaining a cautious distance despite his protective instincts. "Confused and scared," Isabella admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't remember many details from last night, but I remember feeling terribly dizzy and then nothing. The doctor said I was poisoned." Edward studied her every facial expression, searching for signs of acting or falsehood. Isabella seemed genuinely distraught, but he knew she was intelligent and, when necessary in business, manipulative. "Isabella, I need to ask you a very direct question," Edward said, ignoring Peter's warning glance. "Do you remember putting anything in my wine last night?" Isabella's reaction was immediate and seemingly genuine. Her eyes widened in total shock, and she recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "How could you ask that? You think I would try to poison you?" "Someone saw you put something in my drink," Edward pressed, watching her every micro-expression. "A witness saw you add a white powder to my wine." Isabella shook her head vigorously, tears now streaming down her face. "That's impossible, Edward. I would never do something like that. You're the most important person in my life, both personally and professionally." "Then how do you explain the zolpidem in your system?" Detective Riley intervened. "The substance had to come from somewhere." "I don't know," Isabella exclaimed, her voice thick with desperation. "Maybe someone put something in my drink. Maybe I was the target, not Edward." A disturbing possibility began to form in Edward's mind. What if Isabella was truly a victim, What if the real conspiracy involved other people who wanted to eliminate them both or play one against the other? Isabella, Edward said slowly, do you trust everyone we work with at the company? She hesitated for a moment, a shadow of uncertainty crossing her face. Why are you asking that? Please, just answer. Well, I've always thought Roger Friedman showed excessive ambition, she admitted, and Marcia Stone seemed resentful that I was promoted so quickly, but I never imagined they could... Could what? Edward pressed. Could plot. Something against us, Isabella finished, seemingly arriving at the same conclusion. Edward, do you think someone is trying to frame us? Detective Riley took meticulous notes of every word, but Edward noticed skepticism in his expression. Isabella's version sounded too convenient, emerging exactly when she needed a defense. Miss Vance, the detective said, do you have any proof of these suspicions about your colleagues? There's no concrete proof, Isabella admitted, but strange conversations, secret meetings, comments about needing changes in the company's leadership. Edward felt lost in a labyrinth of conflicting possibilities. Isabella could be telling the truth, a victim of a broader conspiracy, or she could be lying masterfully, trying to shift suspicion onto others while maintaining her own innocence. The only certainty he had was that Annie had seen something specific, and now the girl was missing, possibly in mortal danger. Regardless of Isabella's guilt, dangerous forces were in motion, threatening to destroy everything he had worked for. I have to go, Edward announced abruptly, rising from his chair. There are urgent things I need to take care of. Edward, please don't leave thinking I'm guilty, Isabella pleaded. Investigate whatever you need to, but don't let them destroy our relationship based on suspicion. When Edward left the hospital, his mind was more confused than ever, but one thing was clear. He had to find Annie before it was too late. A heavy rain began to fall over the city as Edward received a call that would completely change the course of his investigation. The number was blocked, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably familiar. Annie whispering nervously from a payphone. Uncle Ed? It's me, Annie. I'm really scared, but I need to talk to you. Edward immediately pulled the car over, his heart pounding with relief and worry. Annie, where are you? I've been looking for you for hours. I've been so worried. I'm hiding in an old church near the historic market district, she explained, her voice trembling. Uncle, really bad things have happened. I saw more things. I wasn't supposed to see. What kind of things, little one? Those men in suits who were looking for me. I saw them talking to the pretty lady from the hospital. They don't know I was hiding and could hear everything. Edward felt the ground open up beneath him. Annie, are you sure? Isabella has been in the hospital for almost 24 hours. She snuck out the back door this morning, Annie revealed. I was looking for a safe place near the hospital when I saw her leaving with the bad men. They didn't seem to be forcing her, Uncle. She was laughing and talking like they were friends. The revelation hit Edward like a thunderbolt. If Annie was right, Isabella's entire performance at the hospital had been an elaborate act. She wasn't a confused, vulnerable victim, but a conscious conspirator who was deliberately manipulating the situation. Annie, this is very dangerous, Edward said, starting the car again. Stay right where you are. I'm coming to get you right. Now. Uncle, there's more, the girl insisted. I heard them talking about important papers you'll have to sign tomorrow, and about a man named Roger who's going to take over the company when you go to jail. Edward floored the accelerator, navigating the wet streets toward the market district. Roger Friedman was SureCorp's chief financial officer, an ambitious man Edward had recently promoted against the advice of some board members. If Roger was involved in the conspiracy, it would explain how confidential financial information had leaked to the media. The church Annie mentioned was a century-old building, partially abandoned, located in a run-down part of the city. Edward, parked nearby and walked cautiously through the rain until he found the girl hiding behind the main altar. Annie ran to him as soon as she saw him, hugging his legs tightly. She was wet, shivering from the cold, and obviously terrified, but her eyes shone with the determination of someone who knew she possessed vital information. "Uncle Ed, they're planning something for tomorrow," she said, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her worn sweater. "The pretty lady said you'll have to choose between signing some papers or going to jail." "Nah." "Annie, I need you to tell me everything you heard, word for word," Edward requested, kneeling to her level. Over the next 15 minutes, Annie recounted a conversation that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy against Edward. Isabella was not only knowingly involved, but was one of the scheme's leaders. Along with Roger Friedman and other executives, she had planned a hostile takeover of SureCorp using the poisoning scandal as leverage. "They said you'd be forced to transfer your shares so you wouldn't be charged with attempted murder," Annie explained, "and that afterward they would divide the company among themselves." Edward felt a mixture of rage and admiration for the plan's complexity. Isabella had pursued him romantically, not for love, but as part of a long-term strategy to steal his company. The poisoning was never intended to kill him, but to drug him just enough to force him to sign compromising documents during the event. "Annie, you are the bravest person I know," Edward said, hugging the girl with genuine affection. "Without you, I would have lost everything without even knowing what was happening." "Uncle Ed, they said something that scared me even more," Annie whispered. "They said if the girl who saw everything wasn't found soon, they would make her disappear for good." The threat against Annie confirmed that the conspiracy was far more serious than a simple corporate dispute. These people were willing to harm an innocent child to protect their criminal interests. Edward made a decision that would completely change his strategy. Instead of continuing to defend himself passively, he would go on the offensive. With Annie as his witness and the information she had gathered, he could turn the tables on the conspirators. "Annie, we need to go to the police right now," Edward announced. "But first, we're making a very important stop." "Where, Uncle?" "To the nearest electronics store," Edward replied with a determined smile. "We need to buy a very small, very good recorder." As they left the church under the heavy rain, Edward finally began to feel he had a real chance to reclaim his life and his company. Annie had given him not only the information needed to defend himself, but also the opportunity to expose a conspiracy that went far beyond what he had initially imagined. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in 2 days, Edward Shaw felt he had the weapons to fight back. The electronics store was about to close when Edward and Annie arrived, but the salesman agreed to help them after recognizing the businessman. Edward bought 2 high-quality digital micro-recorders, small enough to be easily hidden, along with wireless earpieces and a smartphone with advanced recording capabilities. "Uncle Ed, do I have to use these things?" Annie asked, looking at the equipment with a mix of fascination and concern. "Only if you feel brave enough," Edward replied, kneeling to her level. "But remember, little one, you've already saved my life once. Now, we have a chance to save the company and make sure these people don't hurt anyone else." During the drive to a discreet hotel where Edward had decided to stay temporarily, he explained his plan to Annie. Instead of going directly to the police, they would first gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy. Annie would be coached on how to use the recording equipment if she had another opportunity to overhear important conversations. In the hotel room, Edward called Peter Nash and asked the lawyer to come immediately, bringing a trusted private investigator. While they waited, he helped Annie take a warm bath and ordered new clothes for her from room service. "You know, Annie," Edward said as he gently brushed the girl's hair, "when I was a kid, I also lived on the streets for a while. I know how scary it is not to have anyone to protect you. What happened to your parents, Uncle Ed? Annie asked, for the first time showing curiosity about his life. Edward hesitated for a moment, then decided to share his story. My father left us when I was 7, and my mother got sick and was admitted to a public hospital. I spent almost 2 years in shelters and on the streets before a kind teacher adopted me. Is that why you're always nice to me? Exactly, Edward confirmed, feeling a deep emotional connection with the girl. And that's why I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about having a safe place to live again. Peter Nash arrived accompanied by Laura Miles, a private investigator specializing in corporate crime. Laura was a woman in her 40s, a former federal agent with an impeccable reputation for uncovering complex business fraud. Edward, this situation is more serious than we imagined, Peter announced, after hearing the full account of events. If Annie is right about Isabella leaving the hospital, that constitutes obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Laura examined the recording equipment and approved of its quality. We need solid evidence before we act. A premature accusation could alert the conspirators and cause them to destroy important evidence. What's your plan? Edward asked. Tomorrow is Tuesday, Laura explained, consulting a tablet. According to the intel Annie gathered, they plan to force you to sign documents. That means there will be a meeting or a direct confrontation. I suggest you show up at the office as usual tomorrow, Peter added. Act as if you know nothing about the conspiracy. Let them initiate their plan while we gather evidence. Annie, who had been quiet during the adults' conversation, timidly raised her hand. Can I help too? I know how to hide really well, and no one suspects a kid. Edward looked at the girl with a mixture of pride and concern. Annie, that could be very dangerous. Uncle Ed, those bad people want to hurt you, and they might hurt other kids too, she said with a determination surprising for her age. I want to help stop them. Laura studied Annie for a long moment. If she really wants to help, we can equip her with one of the smaller recorders. Kids can access places adults can't, and she's already proven to be extremely observant. Edward spent the next hour teaching Annie how to use the micro recorder, emphasizing that her safety was more important than any evidence. They rehearsed different scenarios, including danger signals and escape routes if something went wrong. Remember, Annie, Edward said for the 10th time, if you sense any danger, forget the recording and go straight to the safe place we agreed on. During the night, Edward barely slept. For the first time in 48 hours, he felt he had a solid strategy, but the responsibility of protecting Annie weighed heavily on his conscience. The girl had already risked so much to help him, and now he was allowing her to be exposed to even more danger. Annie, on the other hand, slept soundly for the first time in days. She was clean, warm, fed, and most importantly, she felt useful and valued. For a child who had spent her life being ignored by society, having respectful adults ask for her help with something important was profoundly empowering. When morning came, Edward watched Annie carefully tuck the small recorder into a secret pocket Laura had sewn into her new blouse. The determination in the girl's eyes reminded him of himself decades ago, when he had decided he would never again be a victim of circumstance. Are we ready? Edward asked, adjusting his own tie. Ready? Uncle Ed, Annie replied, smiling confidently. Today we're going to catch the bad guys. As they left the hotel and headed downtown, Edward silently promised himself that regardless of the day's outcome, Annie would have a safe and opportunity-filled future. She had given him a second chance at life, and he would do the same for her. The war against the conspirators was officially beginning, and this time Edward would not be fighting alone. Tuesday dawned overcast, with a fine drizzle that cast a tense atmosphere over the city's business district. Edward arrived at the Shaw Corp building at 8 a.m., as he usually did, but this time every step was calculated, and every gesture was part of a carefully planned performance. Annie was positioned at a cafe on the opposite corner, pretending to play with dolls provided by Laura, while discreetly observing the movement in the building. The lobby staff greeted Edward with their usual courtesy, but he noticed whispers and curious glances that confirmed the media scandal was affecting his reputation within his own company. Some employees avoided direct eye contact, while others showed discreet support with warm nods. In the elevator, Edward ran into Marcia Stone, the HR director Isabella had mentioned as a possible conspirator. Marcia seemed nervous, constantly fiddling with her hair and checking her phone with unusual frequency. "Good morning, Edward," she said, forcing a smile. "How are you holding up through this terrible situation?" "One day at a time, Marcia," Edward replied diplomatically. "The truth always comes out in the end." Marcia nodded quickly, but Edward noticed she seemed relieved when the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor. Her behavior confirmed his suspicions that the conspiracy involved multiple people within the company. In his office, Edward found a stack of documents on his desk that would not normally be there. Share transfer agreements, special powers of attorney, and corporate merger contracts, exactly the kind of paperwork Annie had heard the conspirators mention. "Mr. Shaw," called Carla, his secretary of 15 years, entering the office with a worried expression. "Mr. Roger Friedman's office called to say he needs to speak with you urgently at 9 o'clock. They said it was about legal matters related to Sunday's incident." Edward thanked her and instructed Carla to confirm the meeting. Internally, his pulse quickened, knowing the crucial moment was approaching. He discreetly checked that his micro-recorder was working correctly and sent a coded message to Laura, informing her that the plan was in motion. At 9 o'clock sharp, Roger Friedman entered the office, accompanied by two men Edward didn't recognize. One was obviously a lawyer, carrying an expensive leather briefcase and wearing designer glasses. The other looked more like a private security guard, with broad shoulders and alert eyes that constantly scanned the room. "Edward, thank you for seeing us under such difficult circumstances," Roger said, his voice laced with a false sympathy that couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes. "This is Dr. Michael Vance, a specialist in corporate law, and Mr. Carlos Silva, a corporate security consultant." Edward greeted the men cordially, noting that the security consultant was likely one of the men Annie had seen searching for her on the streets. The visual confirmation made his blood boil, but he maintained a neutral expression. "Roger, I assume this meeting is about the rumors circulating in the media," Edward said, sitting behind his executive desk. "Unfortunately, Edward, it's more serious than rumors," Dr. Vance replied, opening his briefcase. "Our preliminary investigation has uncovered several irregularities in Shaw Corp's recent financial transactions. Combined with the poisoning incident, your legal situation has become complicated." Edward feigned surprise and concern. "What kind of irregularities?" Roger took control of the conversation, clearly comfortable in his role as the betrayer. "Unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts, manipulation of audit reports, over-invoicing. On supply contracts, Edward, I know you didn't do this intentionally, but someone is using your authority for illegal activities." "That's impossible," Edward protested, allowing genuine indignation to surface in his voice. "All of our transactions go through multiple approvals, and that's where the situation gets delicate," Dr. Evans interjected. "The evidence suggests you were being manipulated by someone close to you, someone with intimate access to your passwords and authorizations. Edward saw where this was going. They were laying the groundwork to blame Isabella for the financial wrongdoings, creating a narrative where Edward was both a victim and a perpetrator in need of protection by transferring control of the company. What are you suggesting? Edward asked cautiously. Charles Silver finally spoke, his deep voice carrying a subtle threat. Mr. Shaw, the police already have enough evidence to arrest you for attempted murder and corporate fraud. However, considering your reputation and contributions to the community, there is an alternative. Roger smiled like a predator closing in on its prey. Edward, we've prepared an agreement that will protect you from criminal prosecution and preserve Shaw Corp's reputation. You temporarily transfer operational control of the company to an independent board of directors while you resolve your legal issues. Dr. Evans placed several documents on the table. It's an elegant solution. You retain a minority stake, receive a generous lifelong stipend, and avoid prison. In return, you step away from management until your legal situation is completely resolved. Edward pretended to study the documents, but in reality, he was recording every word of the explicit blackmail. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested tomorrow morning, Charles Silver replied simply. And believe me, Mr. Shaw, we have enough evidence to secure a conviction. Besides, Roger added, there are personal security issues to consider. People involved in financial scandals sometimes face unexpected risks. The veiled threat made Edward clench his fists under the table, but he maintained a pensive expression. I need time to consider. Unfortunately, time is a luxury you don't have, said Dr. Evans. The authorities expect a decision by noon today. As the conspirators continued to pressure Edward to sign, Annie watched from the cafe window, following one of the men who had left the building to make a phone call. With a courage stunning for her age, she moved close enough to activate her recorder and capture a conversation that would reveal an even more sinister dimension to the plot. The cat-and-mouse game was escalating, and Edward knew the next few hours would determine not only the future of his company, but possibly his own life. While Edward feigned analyzing the documents in his office, Annie had managed to strategically position herself behind a decorative column in the building's lobby. Charles Silver had stepped outside for a private phone call, apparently believing a child playing alone posed no threat to the operation's security. The conversation Annie recorded would reveal the true extent of the conspiracy and completely change Edward's understanding of the risks he faced. Yeah, it's all going according to plan, Charles Silver said into his phone, pacing nervously on the sidewalk. The fool is going to sign the papers today, or he's going straight to jail tomorrow. Annie discreetly adjusted the recorder's position, remembering Edward's instructions about capturing complete conversations. No, Vance is still at the hospital putting on a show, Silver continued. She's a good actress. Even I almost bought her performance yesterday. Her plan to fake being poisoned herself worked perfectly. The revelation definitively confirmed that Isabella was knowingly involved and that her hospitalization was an elaborate sham. About the kid, Silver said, lowering his voice. We still haven't located her, but relax, a street kid is a non-issue. Who's going to believe her word against ours? A chill ran down Annie's spine as she heard her own life being discussed as a minor problem to be solved. Friedman is proving useful, but after he takes control, he'll need to be managed too, Silver continued, a sinister threat in his voice. The boss doesn't like partners who know too much. The conversation revealed that even Roger, who believed he was leading the conspiracy, was actually just a disposable pawn in a much larger plan. Yeah, the operation extends to other companies too, Silver confirmed. Shaw is just the first target. We've got a list of 6 more CEOs who are going to go through the same process in the coming months. Annie realized she had stumbled upon something far more serious than a simple attempt to steal a company. This was a criminal organization specializing in taking over businesses through blackmail, fraud, and manipulation. Vance did an exceptional job seducing the target and gathering intel for 8 months, Silva continued. She got access to passwords, confidential documents, business strategies, everything we needed to fabricate the evidence of financial irregularities. The call went on for a few more minutes, revealing details about offshore bank accounts, forged documents, and even the corruption of law enforcement and judicial officials to ensure the charges against Edward would be processed quickly. When Silva finally ended the call and returned to the building, Annie waited a few minutes before running to the cafe where Laura Miles was disguised as a regular customer, monitoring the situation with surveillance equipment. "Aunt Laura," I recorded. "A very important conversation," Annie whispered. Handing over the micro-recorder with trembling hands, Laura discreetly connected the device to a laptop and began listening through headphones. As she listened, her expression grew progressively more grim. "Annie, you're incredible," Laura said when she finished. "This recording proves Edward is facing a professional criminal organization, not just disloyal employees." "Aunt Laura, they said they're going to hurt Uncle Ed, and that I'm not important because I'm just a street kid," Annie reported, tears of indignation shining in her eyes. "You are the most important person in this entire story," Laura assured her, hugging the girl. "Without your courage, Edward would have lost everything without even knowing what hit him." Meanwhile, back in Sais, the office, Edward continued to feign consideration of the conspirators' proposal. Roger was becoming visibly impatient, and Dr. Evans constantly checked his expensive wristwatch. "Edward, I need an answer," Roger pressed. "Every minute of delay makes your legal situation more complicated." "It's a decision that will change my entire life," Edward replied diplomatically. "Surely you can understand that I need time to process all the implications." Charles Silva returned to the office with a more relaxed expression, apparently pleased with his phone call. He gave an almost imperceptible nod to Dr. Evans, who took the signal as confirmation to increase the pressure. "Mr. Shaw, I must inform you that the window of opportunity for this agreement is closing rapidly," Dr. Evans announced formally. "If we do not receive your signature in the next 30 minutes, we will be forced to proceed with the criminal charges." Edward feigned growing panic, letting his hands tremble slightly as he held the documents. "You're forcing me to choose between my freedom and my company." "Exactly," Roger confirmed with ill-disguised satisfaction. "But consider the alternative. Even if you were eventually cleared of the criminal charges, which would take years, Shawcorp would be ruined. This deal at least preserves the company's legacy." "Ian ensures the employees keep their jobs," Dr. Evans added hypocritically. Edward knew that every word was being recorded and that Laura was simultaneously gathering additional evidence through Annie. The more the conspirators talked, the more proof he would have of their criminal activities. "There's one thing that bothers me," Edward said slowly, pretending to study a specific clause. "How can you guarantee I won't face additional legal troubles in the future?" Charles Silva smiled coldly. "Mr. Shaw, when you sign these documents, our organizations will become mutually dependent. It will be in our best interest to protect you from any legal complications." The implicit threat was clear. Once Edward signed, he would become an accomplice in the criminal operation and could not expose them without incriminating himself. Edward glanced out the window and saw Annie in the cafe, pretending to play, but in reality carrying out a mission that could save not only his company, but potentially dozens of other businesses that were future targets of the same criminal organization. Very well, Edward said at last, picking up a pen. Where do I sign? Edward held the pen for a long moment, allowing the tension in the office to mount as the conspirators eagerly awaited his signature. Roger leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Evans nervously adjusted his glasses, and Charles Silver watched every move with the intensity of a predator about to seize its prey. Before I sign, Edward said slowly, I'd like to ask a personal question. Roger? Of course, Edward, anything to help you feel more comfortable with this decision. Edward looked directly into Roger's eyes, seeing a reflection of ambition and betrayal that deeply saddened him. When I started to trust you as my CFO, were you already planning this? Roger hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to reveal his guilt. Edward, this isn't personal, it's just business. You yourself taught me that in the corporate world, sometimes we have to make tough decisions. An interesting philosophy, Edward replied, setting the pen down. And you, Dr. Evans, how many other companies have you applied this same strategy to? Dr. Evans paled slightly. Mr. Shaw, I don't see the relevance of that question to the current situation. Just professional curiosity, Edward said casually. I imagine an operation as sophisticated as this isn't improvised. There must be a pattern, a tested methodology. Charles Silver cut in with growing impatience. Mr. Shaw, time is running out. Either you sign now or we get up and walk out of here. And I assure you, you won't like the consequences. Actually, Edward said, placing the pen on the desk, I think I'd rather face the consequences. The ensuing silence was tense and fraught with menace. Roger frowned, confused by the sudden shift in Edward's attitude. Edward, you're making a terrible mistake, Roger said. Without this deal, you'll be destroyed. Perhaps, Edward agreed, but at least I'll be destroyed with my integrity intact. Charles Silver stood up abruptly, his mask of professionalism finally falling away to reveal his true, menacing nature. Mr. Shaw, you don't understand the gravity of the situation. We have the power to make your life a living hell. You already have, Edward replied calmly. But I've discovered something interesting these past few days. When you have nothing left to lose, you become surprisingly brave. Dr. Evans tried a more diplomatic approach. Mr. Shaw, be reasonable. The evidence against you is irrefutable. This deal is your only salvation. Fabricated evidence, Edward declared, his voice gaining strength. But the interesting question is, do you really believe you managed to fabricate better evidence than the real evidence I've managed to collect? The expressions on the three men's faces changed instantly. Roger shrank back in his chair. Dr. Evans took off his glasses to clean them nervously, and Charles Silver advanced menacingly toward Edward's desk. What are you talking about? Silver asked, his voice dangerously low. Edward smiled for the first time since the meeting began. I'm talking about recorded phone calls, documented confessions, and evidence of a conspiracy that extends far beyond SureCorp. You're bluffing, Roger said, but his voice trembled with uncertainty. Annie is a very observant little girl, Edward continued, and also very brave. You completely underestimated what a determined child can achieve when she wants to protect someone she loves. Charles Silver completely lost his composure. That damn kid, I knew we should have gotten rid of her from the start. An interesting confession, Edward noted, especially considering this entire conversation is being recorded. Dr. Evans shot to his feet, grabbing his briefcase. Mr. Shaw, we have nothing further to discuss here. Actually, we have a lot more to discuss, Edward said, pressing a button on his desk, especially with the guests who have just arrived. The office doors swung open, revealing Laura Miles, accompanied by two FBI agents, Peter Nash and Detective Riley, who had apparently been co-opted by the conspirators but was in fact conducting a parallel investigation. "Gentlemen," Laura announced, "you are all under arrest for racketeering, extortion, corporate fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Charles Silver tried to make a run for the window, but was immediately restrained by the federal agents. Dr. Evans attempted to destroy documents from his briefcase, but Laura had anticipated the move and quickly confiscated all materials. Roger remained seated, seemingly in total shock. "Edward, I didn't know it was this serious. They told me it was just a standard corporate transfer." "Roger," Edward said sadly, "you betrayed 15 years of trust and friendship. There is no explanation that can justify that." As the agents handcuffed the conspirators, Laura explained to Edward that the investigation had begun months ago when other companies reported similar patterns of blackmail and hostile takeovers. "Their operation was much more sophisticated than we imagined," Laura explained. "They had contacts in various institutions, including some corrupt members of the police force itself." "And Isabella?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "She's being arrested at this very moment at the hospital," Detective Riley replied. "She did indeed leave during the night to coordinate today's actions, exactly as Annie reported." Edward looked out the window and saw Annie running across the square toward the building, accompanied by Miss Carmen. The girl had carried out her part of the mission with a courage and intelligence that had left all the adults in awe. When Annie finally reached the office, she ran straight to Edward, who lifted her into an emotional hug. "We did it, Uncle Ed," she exclaimed, beaming with happiness. "The bad guys got caught." "We sure did, little hero," Edward replied, feeling tears of relief and gratitude stream down his face. "You saved not only my company, but probably many other companies as well." As the conspirators were led away in handcuffs, Edward realized that his life had changed irrevocably. He had lost the woman he loved, discovered that some of his most trusted employees were traitors, and faced the real possibility of losing everything he had worked for. But he had also found something more precious than any company or fortune, a daughter of the heart who had taught him the true meaning of loyalty, courage, and unconditional love. 3 days after the arrests, Edward found himself at St. Jude's Hospital for the last time, not as a worried visitor, but as a victim confronting his attacker. Isabella had requested a private meeting through her lawyers, claiming to have crucial information about other aspects of the conspiracy that could benefit the federal investigation. Annie had insisted on accompanying him, and after much debate, Edward agreed, understanding that the girl needed this emotional closure as much as he did. Laura Miles and Peter Nash were also present, along with federal agents who would monitor every word of the conversation. Isabella was no longer in the ICU, but in a regular room under police custody. When Edward and Annie entered, they found a woman visibly different from the one they knew. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale without makeup, and her eyes held a mixture of desperation and cold calculation. "Edward," she said softly, trying to recreate the intimacy they once shared. "Thank you for coming. I know I don't deserve your consideration after everything." Edward remained standing, maintaining physical and emotional distance. Annie hid partially behind him, closely watching the woman who had tried to harm her protector. "Isabella, your lawyers said you have important information," Edward said coldly. "It had better be relevant, because this will be our last conversation." Genuine tears began to stream down Isabella's face, and for a moment, Edward almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Edward, I need you to understand that it wasn't all a lie," she began desperately. "When we first met, yes, I was following instructions, but over the months I truly fell in love with you. Then why did you go through with the plan?" Edward asked, his voice thick with barely concealed pain. "Because they had compromising evidence about my past," Isabella revealed, sobbing. "Things I had done years ago when I was financially desperate. They blackmailed me just as much as they..." "Blackmailed you?" Annie whispered something in Edward's ear. He nodded gravely before responding. Annie wants to know why you tried to poison me if you really loved me. Isabella looked at the girl for the first time, and Edward saw recognition and something akin to shame in her eyes. The plan was never to kill you, Edward, Isabella explained. It was to drug you just enough for you to sign the share transfer documents during the event. You would have been found unconscious, apparently having suffered a collapse from stress, and the papers would have already been signed. But you drank the wine that was meant for me, Edward observed. Because that brave little girl warned you, and you switched the glasses, Isabella said, looking directly at Annie. A 6-year-old child was smarter than an operation planned. For months. Annie stepped out from behind Edward and approached the bed, displaying a courage that impressed all the adults present. Why did you want to hurt Uncle Ed? Annie asked with the brutal honesty of children. He's a good person. He always gave me food when I was hungry. Isabella began to cry more intensely. Because I'm a weak person, little one. And weak people sometimes do terrible things when they're scared. Edward felt a complex emotion watching the interaction. Annie, who had suffered abandonment and neglect her whole life, demonstrated more moral strength and integrity than adults who had been given every opportunity in the world. Isabella, your information, Laura Miles interrupted professionally. The organization is much larger than you realize, Isabella revealed, wiping her tears. They have operations in 6 states, have infiltrated dozens of companies, and have corrupted officials in banks, county clerks' offices, and the courts. Over the next hour, Isabella provided names, dates, bank accounts, and operational details that would allow the FBI to dismantle the entire criminal network. She had kept secret records as a kind of life insurance, never imagining she would one day use them to protect herself. Why are you telling us this now? Edward asked when she finished. Because I found out they planned to eliminate me after. The operation succeeded, Isabella admitted. I was an inconvenient witness who knew too much. Charles Silver had already been instructed to deal with the Isabella problem as soon as you signed the documents. The revelation confirmed that even the conspirators were disposable in the criminal organization's structure. And also, Isabella continued, looking directly at Annie, because a 6-year-old girl showed me what true courage means. She risked her safety to protect someone she loved, while I destroyed someone I loved to protect myself. Edward felt he had reached the emotional closure he needed. Isabella was not the woman he had fallen in love with. That person had never truly existed. But she was also not the completely malevolent monster he had imagined in his moments of greatest anger. Isabella, Edward said finally, I hope you find a way to redeem yourself in prison. But our story ends here. As they prepared to leave, Isabella called out to Annie one last time. Little one, you saved much more than just Edward. You saved dozens of other people who would have been harmed in the future. You are a true hero. Annie studied Isabella for a long moment with the seriousness of someone far beyond her years. I forgive you, Annie said simply, but don't do bad things anymore, okay? The innocent yet profound response made Isabella break down in renewed tears, but this time they were tears of redemption, not self-pity. When Edward and Annie left the hospital for the last time, he realized that a painful chapter of his life had finally closed. Isabella's betrayal still hurt, but it would no longer define his future. Looking at Annie, who walked beside him with growing confidence, Edward understood that sometimes we lose people we thought we loved to find the people we truly need in our lives. 2 weeks after the hospital confrontation, Edward was in Peter Nash's office finalizing the last legal details that would mark the official end of the case. Annie sat in a high chair beside him, swinging her legs and coloring in a new sketchbook Edward had bought her. The information Isabella provided led to the arrest of 43 individuals across 6 states, Peter reported, consulting a thick federal report. The criminal enterprise has been completely dismantled and several companies that were future targets have been saved. Edward nodded with satisfaction, but his attention was split between the legal report and Annie's drawings, which showed a happy family consisting of a man in a suit and a little girl with braids. "And the charges against me?" Edward asked, though he knew he had been fully exonerated. "All officially dropped," Peter confirmed. "Furthermore, the FBI has recommended that you and Annie receive a commendation for civilian service." Annie looked up from her drawing. "What's a commendation, Uncle Peter?" "It's an award the government gives to very brave people who have helped others," Peter explained warmly. "Like a medal?" she asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Exactly like a medal," Edward confirmed, stroking her hair. Laura Miles entered the office carrying a final folder and a smile of professional satisfaction. "Edward, I have some excellent news about the recovery of Shaw Corp's assets. Did you manage to track the diverted money?" Edward asked. "Not only did we track it, we've recovered 92% of the funds," Laura announced. "Additionally, the companies that were previous victims of the same organization are filing a joint lawsuit for damages, which will result in significant compensation." A wave of relief washed over Edward that he hadn't felt in weeks. His company had not only survived the conspiracy, but would emerge financially stronger than before. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Peter said, his expression turning more serious. "Annie's legal status." Edward sat up straighter, instinctively protective. "What kind of legal status?" "As she has no official documents or known relatives, she is technically in the custody of the state," Peter explained carefully. "However, given her heroic role in the case and her relationship with you, there are several legal options available." Annie stopped drawing and looked between the adults with growing concern. "Do I have to go back to the streets, Uncle Ed?" "Never," Edward declared, firmly taking her hand. "Peter, what are my options to ensure Annie has a permanent home with me?" "Formal adoption would be the most direct path," Peter replied. "Considering the special circumstances of the case and the recommendations from various authorities, the process can be significantly expedited." Edward looked at Annie, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and fear of disappointment that broke his heart. "Annie," he said softly, "would you like to officially be my daughter?" The girl's reaction was immediate and emotional. She jumped from her chair and threw herself into Edward's arms, hugging him tightly as tears of happiness streamed down her face. "Does that mean I can call you Daddy?" she asked between emotional sobs. "It means you'll be my daughter forever," Edward confirmed, his own tears mingling with hers. Laura and Peter watched the scene with emotional smiles, witnessing a happy ending emerge from the ashes of betrayal and conspiracy. "There's one more thing," Laura said when the emotional moment subsided. "The media is asking for interviews about the case. You're being treated as national heroes." Edward considered the proposal for a moment. "Annie, would you like to tell our story to other people?" "Can I talk about how important it is to protect the people we love?" she asked seriously. "Of course you can, my little hero." Over the following days, the newly adopted father and daughter participated in several interviews that captured the nation's imagination. The story of a businessman saved by a brave little girl resonated with millions, inspiring discussions about child welfare, social inequality, and the importance of valuing every voice, regardless of age or social status. Shaw Corp received hundreds of partnership and investment offers from companies wanting to associate with the reputation for integrity Edward had demonstrated during the crisis. More importantly, Edward implemented permanent corporate programs to support at-risk children. Roger Friedman, facing years in prison for his crimes, sent a letter of apology that Edward read but chose not to answer. Some betrayals were simply irreparable, and Edward chose to focus his emotional energy on relationships that deserved his trust. Miss Carmen visited Edward and Annie at their new home, a mansion that now echoed with children's laughter and had a room specially decorated with princess and superhero themes. Annie was always special, Miss Carmen said, watching the girl play in the garden. But I never imagined she'd become famous for saving a businessman. She saved me in more ways than just financially, Edward reflected. She taught me that family isn't just about blood, but about who is willing to risk themselves to protect you. Annie ran inside, beaming with happiness. "Daddy Ed, can you help me with my homework?" "Of course, Princess," Edward replied, realizing how the words Daddy Ed sounded perfectly natural. As he helped Annie with math exercises at the kitchen table, Edward reflected on how his life had completely changed in just 1 month. He had lost a girlfriend who never really existed, discovered betrayals from employees he trusted, and faced the possibility of losing his company and his freedom. But he had found something infinitely more valuable: a daughter who loved him unconditionally and who had taught him that true wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in the courage to do what's right and the willingness to protect those who need our protection. Annie finished her exercises and looked at Edward with the smile that now brightened his days. "Daddy Ed, do you think other kids who live on the streets can find families that love them too?" "Absolutely, my dear," Edward replied, already planning to expand SureCorp's social programs. "And you and I are going to help make that happen." 5 weeks after that fateful night at the Grand Majestic Hotel, Edward and Annie returned to the same luxurious ballroom, but this time for a completely different celebration. The room was decorated with pink and gold balloons, tables covered with colorful sweets, and a 3-tiered cake that glittered with 7-shaped candles. Annie, now officially Annie Shaw, wore a sky blue dress she had chosen herself, her hair in an elegant updo done by a professional stylist. Her eyes shone with happiness as she surveyed the decorations for her first official birthday party. "Daddy Ed, is all this really for me?" she asked for the 10th time, still in disbelief. "All for you, my princess," Edward confirmed, adjusting. The tie Annie had insisted he wear, the same one he'd worn on the night of the poisoning, but which now symbolized rebirth instead of betrayal. The ballroom gradually filled with special guests. Miss Carmen arrived in her best dress, accompanied by several other children from the shelter, whom Annie had insisted on inviting. Laura Miles and Peter Nash were there with their families, along with loyal SureCorp employees who had supported Edward through the crisis. Even more touching was the presence of families who had benefited from the company's new social programs. 10 children who had previously lived on the streets now had permanent homes thanks to the foundation Edward had established in Annie's name. "Uncle Ed, Daddy Ed," said an 8-year-old girl named Carla, one of the program's first beneficiaries. "Thank you for showing us that all kids deserve a family." Edward felt tears well up as he watched the ripple effect of one girl's courage. Annie had saved not only his life and company, but had inspired a movement that was transforming the lives of dozens of other children. When it was time to cut the cake, Annie insisted that Edward stand beside her. The party's official photographer, the same one who had covered the fateful corporate event, now captured moments of pure joy instead of scandal and betrayal. "Make a wish before you blow out the candles," Edward instructed. Annie closed her eyes in serious concentration, her hands clasped as if in prayer. When she opened them, there was a mature determination in her gaze that impressed everyone. "I wish that other kids who are alone find families who love them like you love me," she announced, before blowing out all 7 candles at once. The applause that followed was warm and emotional, but Edward could barely join in, awestruck by his adopted daughter's emotional maturity and generosity of spirit. During the party, Edward had the chance to talk with many of the guests about how their lives had changed since the events of 5 weeks ago. Dr. Carter, who had treated Isabella at the hospital, commented on how the case had inspired new security protocols at corporate events. Detective Riley, who had been revealed as an honest investigator working secretly to expose police corruption, brought updates on the conspirators' trials. Isabella had pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence and was fully cooperating with the authorities. "She asked me to tell you that she's proud of the man you've become through this experience," the detective reported, "and that she hopes Annie will one day understand that even people who make terrible mistakes can learn from a child's act of courage." Edward nodded thoughtfully. He had found peace with Isabella's betrayal, understanding that some painful experiences are necessary to lead us where we need to be. As the party continued, Annie circulated among the guests with growing confidence, telling stories about her new life and asking intelligent questions about everyone's jobs and families. There was no longer any sign of the shy, frightened child Edward had met on the streets months ago. As the celebration wound down, Edward stepped onto the small stage that had been set up for the occasion. The ballroom fell silent, awaiting his words. "Friends," Edward began, his voice thick with emotion, "5 weeks ago, I stood in this very ballroom believing I had everything. Business success, solid relationships, and a life that made sense. But I discovered I was fundamentally wrong about almost everything." He looked at Annie, who watched him with full attention. "A brave 6-year-old girl taught me that true wealth isn't in material possessions or corporate positions, but in the willingness to protect those who need our protection. She showed me that family isn't defined by blood, but by unconditional love and mutual sacrifice." Edward paused, letting the words resonate in the silent room. "Annie didn't just save my company and my freedom. She saved my soul, reminding me of who I really am and what truly matters in life." Today, as we celebrate her 7th birthday, we also celebrate the transformative power of courage, truth, and love. The applause was long and enthusiastic, but Edward only had eyes for Annie, who ran to the stage and hugged him tightly. "Daddy Ed," she whispered in his ear, "you saved my life too. Now we're a real family." When the last guests had departed and the ballroom was empty, Edward and Annie lingered for a few minutes, looking at the place where it all began. The festive decorations contrasted dramatically with the formal elegance of the corporate gala 5 weeks ago. "Daddy Ed," Annie said, taking his hand, "do you think that Lady Isabella will be okay in prison?" The question demonstrated the capacity for forgiveness and empathy that constantly surprised Edward in his daughter. "I think she'll use that time to become a better person," Edward answered honestly. "Sometimes we have to face serious consequences to learn important lessons, like how I had to live on the streets to find you." Edward smiled, touched by the simple yet profound observation. "Exactly like that, Princess. Sometimes the hardest roads lead us to the most important destinations." As they left the hotel hand in hand, Edward reflected on how a night of betrayal and conspiracy had become the foundation of a true family. Annie had entered his life as a voice, whispering a desperate warning, but she had become the heart that gave meaning to his entire existence. The last image Edward kept from that special night was of Annie asleep in the back seat of the car, clutching a small teddy bear she had received at the party, a serene smile on her face. She had started life with nothing, but now she possessed something money could never buy, a family that loved her unconditionally, and a future filled with infinite possibilities. Edward had also found his true wealth. He no longer measured success in financial figures or corporate achievements, but in the smiles of a little girl who called him Dad, in lives transformed through social programs, and in the absolute certainty that he had learned the difference between having everything and having what truly matters. The journey that had begun with a desperate whisper in the dark had ended with happy laughter in the light. And Edward knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The story of a family created not by fate, but by the conscious choice of two hearts that decided to love and protect each other forever.